For wrestling fans who were around in the 90s, it was a time of battle. And that was because the two biggest promotions of the era, WWF and WCW, were constantly at each other's throats, attempting to attain dominance. Obviously then, this led to a lot of great television, but more importantly than that, it created two great places for wrestlers to work, with there being a few who actually succeeded in both. But just who are the best examples of wrestlers who achieved greatness in both WWF and WCW? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with Hulk Hogan? Yes, how could we begin anywhere else, because in many ways, it was Hulk Hogan who was responsible for WCW taking the lead for a while during the Monday Night Wars. That said, before he did this, he was the perennial face of WWF throughout the 80s and even into the very early 90s. In fact, so big of a star was he here that even to this day, many call him the greatest WWE superstar of all time. But then how couldn't they when he's given us such iconic moments as his showdown with Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, his Mega Powers pairing with the Macho Man, or his 1,474-day-long title reign with the WWF Championship. Really, all this would be enough to make anyone a legend, and when you take into account the fact that he was the face of the entire promotion throughout its first boom period then, he can be thought of as nothing less than a full-blown pop culture icon. That said, this wouldn't be the only legendary run the Hulkster had, because when he moved down to Atlanta in 1994, he'd there reinvent the business all over again for a whole new decade. And the way he'd do it this time would be to turn heel and form the New World Order, the coolest group of villains the wrestling industry had ever seen at the time. Hell, so cool were they that they'd helped WCW to obtain an 83-week win streak in the ratings during the heights of the Monday Night Wars, an impressive achievement for a promotion which prior to that looked like it had no chance of ever fully competing with what Vince McMahon was doing on a mainstream level. But then we guess that's just a testament to the star power of Hulk Hogan. Well, that and two other men who also served as founding members of the NWO, the first of which we're going to look at today being Kevin Nash. Now, what made Kevin Nash's jumping over to WCW in 1996 so special was that the year prior to this, he'd been such a big deal in the WWF. He'd actually been their world champion. And this was a belt that he'd not only held for the better part of a year, but one which he won by absolutely destroying former champ Bob Backlund in 8 seconds. So to consider Big Sexy anything less than a success in the Fed would be a lie then, even if he wasn't always able to put on great bouts or draw money. But of course, his ability to draw money wouldn't be an issue once he moved over to Ted Turner's promotion, as once he became a founding member of the NWO, there he'd change the fortunes of everyone around him almost overnight, rocketing them all the way up to the top of the very industry. And that wasn't all he was doing in WCW either, as after serving as a one-time world champion, one-time intercontinental champion, and two-time tag team champion up in WWE, he'd win further gold down south by there becoming a 5-time world champion and 9-time tag team champion. Yes, as Scott Steiner would once say, the numbers don't lie. And the sheer amount of gold Kevin Nash was able to hold in both companies alone proves just how much of a success he was in each of them. Of course, it's not all about titles though. No, it's also about getting those big moments. Big moments the Detroit native was no stranger to, no matter which side he was working for. And many of these big moments came with his Outsiders tag team partner, the third original member of the NWO, Scott Hall. That's right, we have to include the bad guy in today's video, as he's one of the prime examples of people succeeding in both WWF and WCW. After all, while working for Vince McMahon during the early to mid-90s as Razor Ramon, he was able to be just about the coolest thing on TV at various points, even if he was often supposed to be the villain. Need any evidence of his greatness during this time? Just look at his 4 Intercontinental title runs and his 2 iconic ladder matches with Shawn Michaels. And as if that's not enough, how about the fact that as a member of the Clique, he pretty much ran things backstage for a spell? That said, for as much success as Hall found in the Fed, once he went to WCW in 1996 and started a hostile takeover of that company too, he reached another level of fame altogether, as this was when, now going by his real name, he became a key figure in WCW, dominating WWF in the ratings for so long. Sure, he often had his own personal issues to deal with, but this rarely got in the way of him doing his best work on TV. In fact, we'd argue that of those original 3 NWO members who jumped ship from WWF to WCW, he was easily the best in-ring performer of the bunch, and arguably the one who history has looked back on the most fondly. But it wasn't all about the New World Order when it came to people who succeeded in both major North American wrestling promotions back then. No, sometimes the success story in each had nothing to do with that group, as was the case with Ric Flair. Yes, Ric Flair, the 16-time-plus world champion and arguably the greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots, has been able to find success just about anywhere he's gone during his lengthy and illustrious career. That said, if someone was to force us to choose where his best years lay, it would undoubtedly be in Jim Crockett Promotions / WCW. After all, that was where he won the vast majority of his world titles, and it was also where he had the vast majority of his classic matches. Classic matches which included his showdowns against the likes of Rick Steamboat, Terry Funk, Dusty Rhodes, and Sting! Of course, that's not to say he didn't succeed in WWE either, though. No, quite the opposite, because during his first run there in the early 90s, he'd actually become a two-time champion and one-time winner of the Royal Rumble. And then, during his second run there in the 2000s, he'd succeed all over again by becoming a tag team champion on multiple occasions and a founding member of Evolution. So really, every period he spent in WWE, while perhaps not as iconic as his time down south in the grand scheme of things, was enough to see him become a well-deserved Hall of Famer. But what of the yin to his yang in many ways, a famous rival of his from Jim Crockett Promotions? Well, he's the next person we want to look at now as it happens, because when it comes to Ricky Steamboat, he also succeeded in both WWE and WCW. How did this success play itself in the latter promotion? Well, for one, it would be through his iconic trilogy with the Nature Boy, a trilogy which saw him become NWA World's Champion. And even when Jim Crockett Promotions transformed into WCW, the Dragon would continue to find success there over the years as a United States Champion, Television Champion, and Tag Team Champion. That said, there were also times during this period where he wasn't working for WCW at all. No, he was actually under Vince McMahon's employ, and while there, Steamboat proved exactly why he deserved to be called one of the best in the world, most memorably at WrestleMania 3 when, in his classic bout with the Macho Man, he was able to introduce WWF fans to the idea that in-ring work could be just as important to making the show entertaining. Of course, despite winning the Intercontinental title here, Ricky's time with WWF would come to an end soon thereafter, as he made the jump back over to his original home of WCW and continued to wow audiences down south for a while. But that doesn't mean he'd never return to the WWE again, as after years of retirement, he'd make a shocking in-ring comeback in 2009 and would there prove that he was almost as good as he ever had been, despite now being in his mid-50s. But then we suppose when you're a talent on the level of the Dragon, age truly is just a number. It's just a shame we couldn't have seen what our next subject did as he got older then, as we're pretty sure he was in the same category. Who are we talking about here? Why, another name who succeeded in both WWE and WCW, of course, none other than Randy Savage. Ooh yeah, if you were a fan of wrestling during the 80s, then it goes without saying you were a fan of the Macho Man, as he was just so engaging, so charismatic and entertaining, it was impossible not to be. In fact, you could argue that aside from Hulk Hogan, he was easily the biggest star of that first boom period. And this was evident in the fact that in an era completely dominated by the Hulkster, he was still able to become WWF Champion on 2 separate occasions, and even main event WrestleMania 5. And even when he wasn't on top of the card, he was still regularly stealing the show, something his WrestleMania 3 and 7 bouts against Ricky Steamboat and the Ultimate Warrior respectively proved. Hell, even when WWF tried to upstage him at WrestleMania 8 by having him go on prior to Hulk Hogan and Sid, Randy still made sure fans were talking about his match by the time the night was over. So it really should come as little surprise then that when he moved over to WCW in 1994, the Macho Man would waste no time in replicating this success by becoming a 4-time world champion there too. And it wasn't just his ability to win gold which solidified him as a great of Atlanta either. No, there was also the fact that whether it be as a heel member of the NWO or a babyface hero of the people, he was still able to put out matches which were good enough to steal the show, perhaps most notably during his feud with Diamond Dallas Page. Sadly though, as he would die in 2011, we would never get to see Savage return to WWE after WCW folded, and this meant he'd never get that great second run there that so many hoped he might. But even if this is the case, it doesn't change the fact that during his time with each company, he was a massive star and a massive part of the reason people tuned in on a weekly basis. And while he was proving such star power for the singles division, over in the tag division that work was being done by our next subjects, the Road Warriors. Now, we shouldn't need to explain to anyone out there who the Road Warriors are, as they're probably the most iconic and celebrated duo in the history of tag team wrestling. But for those who do need a primer, basically, back in the 80s, there was no one more dominating than them, as wherever they went, whoever they went up against, they were going to be doing two things: not selling their opponent's offense and winning the bout. And this made them huge stars in Jim Crockett Promotions specifically, as well as in WCW when this later rose out of the ashes of JCP. So successful were they in these promotions, in fact, that while working for them, they'd become one-time NWA World Tag Team Champions and three-time NWA World Six-Man Tag Team Champions. Of course, WCW wouldn't be the only place Hawk and Animal absolutely dominated during the golden era though, as in 1990, they'd finally make the jump over to WWF to work for Vince McMahon for a couple of years. And during this time, now under the name of the Legion of Doom, they'd get so over that they became tag team champions on a further two occasions. And that wasn't their only run in WWE either, as years later in 1997 and 1998, they'd also make an appearance during the early days of the Attitude Era to help get teams like the New Age Outlaws over. Sure, this run might not be their most well-remembered, but it showed the longevity the team had, and proved that even as a new millennium was dawning, there was still an audience who wanted to see the Road Warriors do their thing. But what about someone who started out as a tag team act and then made it big as a single star in both WWE and WCW? Well, that's the person we want to talk about next as it happens, the one, the only, Booker T. Yes, the five-time WCW champion might have started out as one half of Harlem Heat alongside his real-life brother Stevie Ray, and he may have found a huge amount of success here as a 10-time tag team champion. But once he decided to go solo in 1997, he truly broke out as a main event player and someone who could help to carry the company on his shoulders. Unfortunately for him though, by the time WCW was placed on Booker's shoulders, it was already collapsing. And that was why, after winning their top gold on 5 separate occasions, he'd be forced to jump over to WWF during the invasion and there rebuild himself from scratch all over again. How would this work out for him? Excellently, as it happened, because almost immediately, the Houston native would be portrayed as a main event guy. And his versatility and ability to be both a serious or comedic character, depending on what the situation asked of him, would eventually see him rise all the way to the top when in 2006, he became World Heavyweight Champion under his King Booker guise. But that's not the only success Booker T had in WWE, as aside from that, he also took part in some very memorable feuds and partnerships with the likes of Goldust, Chris Benoit, and Rey Mysterio. And all this was enough to make him a legend in WWE once all was said and done, just as his prior work in WCW had made him a legend there too back in the day. Is he a greater legend than our next subject though? Someone who also succeeded in both promotions? Well, that's up for you to decide. Who are we talking about here? Jeff Jarrett. That's right, Jeff Jarrett, the man who cannot be killed in wrestling terms because no matter the era, he always finds himself with a prominent role in a prominent company. And perhaps his most prominent role of all came for him in WCW during the late 90s and early 2000s, as this was when he was pushed as one of the top guys they had, good enough to be a world champion on 4 separate occasions, and trusted to carry David Arquette through much of his high-profile run with the company. Sure, you could argue that this spell on top coinciding with the downfall of World Championship Wrestling is a mark against Double J, but we can't exactly blame the fall of WCW on him. No, that fall came from a combination of bad booking by the heads of creative at the time, as well as Time Warner's decision to no longer want wrestling on their network. And if you need any further evidence that what happened to WCW wasn't Jeff Jarrett's fault, you need only to look at his runs in WWF during the 90s, as here, while he was never exactly a main eventer, he was always a hugely reliable and underrated presence, someone who could be counted on to put on a solid performance no matter who he was up against. Hell, it was for this reason the company made him Intercontinental Champion on 6 separate occasions. Sure, his run in WWF might not have ended well and may have led to bad blood between him and Vince McMahon for years afterwards, but that bad blood has since dissipated, so all that's left to focus on now are his good times there. Good times which made him the legend he is today, and the man who can still get audiences invested whenever he appears on TV over in AEW, the same locker room he now shares with our next subject, The Big Show. Of course, before Paul White was all elite, he was perhaps most famous for his lengthy run in the WWE where, between 1999 and 2021, he was an ever-present fixture on WWE television. No, he wasn't always in a prominent spot. Sometimes, in fact, he was one step above being a glorified jobber. but whenever he was given some focus, he usually made the most out of it by becoming a dominant main event force, someone good enough to win multiple world titles, main event WrestleManias, and even technically win the 2000 Royal Rumble. But then this level of success he achieved in the Fed wouldn't have been surprising to anyone who'd follow his career in WCW prior to that, as there, he was just as big of a deal. In fact, it was in Atlanta that on his first night on the job, he managed to defeat Hulk Hogan to become WCW champion. And while this reign might have only lasted for one day, it was enough to firmly establish him as a player going forward, which was exactly why, over his next few years there, he continued to rack up wins and bring home gold to add to his trophy cabinet back home. Hell, at one point he'd even become a member of the NWO, with the Giant, as he was then known, serving as the powerhouse enforcer of the group for a while. And because of that, even when the NWO went to WWE in 2002, Paul White would be there to rejoin them and help keep the whole faction afloat for a little bit longer. That said, when it comes to his run in WWE, joining the NWO is probably one of the Big Show's least memorable moments, as there's just so much which supersedes this. Moments like him feuding with Brock Lesnar, teaming with Kane, or taking part in that excellent hardcore title brawl at WrestleMania 17 with the Big Red Machine and Raven. In fact, when you break it all down, you could make the argument that of all the big men to succeed in both WWE and WCW, the Big Show is the most successful of all. But then you could also make that argument for our next subject too in many ways. Who is this subject? Who else but Sid? Now, we know Sid never exactly had a sustained run of fans getting behind him as a top guy because, well, there was the fact that he wasn't exactly the best in-ring wrestler in the world. And on top of that, there was also the fact that his promos generally sounded like they'd been written by someone with half the brain you do.
You're only half the man that I am, and I have half the brain that you do.
That said, none of this was enough to stop the Arkansas native from becoming a big star in both companies at various points. How did he achieve such a thing then? Well, mostly through sheer charisma, as even when he was speaking incomprehensibly, Sid still had something captivating about him. It's why he suddenly got so over with WWF fans in 1992, in fact, when he eliminated secret heel Hulk Hogan from that year's Royal Rumble. And it's also why he got just as over in 1996 when he absolutely destroyed then world champion Shawn Michaels in front of Madison Square Garden at the Survivor Series. So given his ability to become a star in the WWF then, by doing things such as being a two-time WrestleMania main eventer, should anyone be surprised that during his various runs with WCW, Sid was also a big deal there too? Of course not. In fact, the only surprise is that he didn't become an even bigger deal. That's not to say he didn't achieve a lot over there though. No, during his first run in Atlanta during the late 80s and early 90s, he'd at one point become a member of the Four Horsemen, and during his second run there in the late 90s and early 2000s, he'd become a one-time world champion. So put some respect on Sid's name, because while he might not be a legend on the level of a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels, he's achieved almost as much as they have in many ways, and he's done all this while simultaneously juggling a side career in softball. And that's ultimately something even our next subject can't say they did, another success story in both WWE and WCW, the late, great Rick Rude. Of course, in Rick Rude's case, he particularly stands out as he's the only person who ever managed to appear on both Raw and Nitro on the same night at the same time, a feat he achieved back in 1997. But for as cool as this was, that wasn't what made him a success in both companies. No, what made him a success was his ability to get over with fans regardless of which audience he was playing to. In WCW, this meant being the workhorse who could be part of the Dangerous Alliance and who could feud with the likes of Sting, Ric Flair, and Ricky Steamboat, all before leaving the company for a while and later returning to serve as a member of the NWO. And in WWE, meanwhile, this meant having a successful first run there where, amongst other things, he did everything he could to get the Ultimate Warrior over as WWF champion, all before taking a break and coming back just in time to be the often forgotten founding member of D-Generation X during the beginnings of the Attitude Era. Yes, when you break it down, the real key to the longevity and success of Rick Rude was that he was able to adapt to his environment and know exactly what each fan base wanted. And it was such adaptability that saw him win numerous pieces of gold across both promotions, with the list of titles he held around his waist including the Intercontinental Championship, the United States Championship, the NWA World Tag Team Championship, and the forgotten brief world title of WCW, the International World Heavyweight title. But then, to be fair, the same malleability and ability to vary things up has been the secret of success for everyone we've discussed today, as between them all, they've each showed how you can get over in not only one big league, but two.